Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help you, our listeners from Los Angeles to Long Island, make your second half of life even better than the first. Over the last half century, we've witnessed a blizzard of technological advances that have had a profound impact on our daily lives. But if we take the time to reflect for a moment and look around at the commonplace devices we take for granted, we would discover that many of them actually had their origin during an era we don't normally associate with innovation, the Middle Ages. In today's episode, author and producer John W. Farrell takes us through a fascinating series of stories in his book, The Clock and the Camshaft, that describe how dozens of inventions that are part of virtually every aspect of contemporary technology had their roots in medieval times between the 11th and 14th centuries. John takes us behind the invention of the key mechanism in the mechanical clock, perhaps as a means of automating the ringing of church bells. He'll explain how cylindrical axles, known as camshafts, originated in windmills centuries before they evolved into a key component of the internal combustion engine. We'll take a walk through architectural innovations like flying buttresses, which allowed the design of grand cathedrals. Then there were social innovations, such as universities, ignited by the popes as a way to protect the church against European monarchs, and the mariner's astrolabe and the compass, tools that helped spur the expansion of European trade and enable navigators like Columbus to take real chances outside the comfortable commerce between Mediterranean port cities. Perhaps most remarkable in John's themes throughout his stories is the refreshing discovery that while many of the world's most important inventions were due to the ingenuity of particular individuals, many others came out of the work of everyday people whose names may be unknown today, but whose legacy laid the foundation of the modern world. So now, John, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's delighted to be here.
Yeah. And before we dive into a little bit of your background and the book, John, I just wanted to mention it is a real pleasure for me to have you on the show. I have a wide range of topics, many of them pragmatic, covering health or finances or aging in place or long-term planning. And so it's great to have a 45 moment of reflection
Oh,
where
thank you so much.
where we just sort of take, wait a minute, let's just take a step back and look around at life where we are right now and what's going on around us. And this was a great opportunity for me to do that. So again, welcome to the show. And before we actually talked about the book, let me ask you about yourself a little bit, about your journey, because I find many of my guests, in addition to having great things to say about some various subjects, have a very interesting life themselves in terms of their evolution. So you basically began as a science writer, right?
Yes, or actually, I was interested in creative writing since I was a kid.
Hmm.
Middle school, high school, I edited the high school literary magazine, that kind of thing. And then as an undergrad, I had to take, there was a science requirement, and I picked a year-long survey course in the history of astronomy.
Hmm.
I mean, I just thought it was astronomy, but I didn't realize the professor was also a professor of the history of astronomy, and I just fell in love with the topic. And I actually considered whether I should major in history of science, but I was so far behind in calculus with everybody else. I thought by the time I catch up, it'll be time to graduate. So I stuck with English and American literature, but I started reading history of science. And then my first writing job was actually for union newspapers, government employee union newspapers, which was quite a way to kind of break into journalism. And then the history of science aspect was kind of a serendipity. What happened was there was a kind of a crackpot article in National Review written by a guy who claimed that Einstein was probably wrong, and a friend of mine can show you why. And
Huh.
I was like so outraged that they published that without any kind of review. I wrote this long angry letter to the editor, and they published it. So from there in, I started getting requests to do book reviews and stuff like that. But
Right.
I mean, I was already interested in the topic, but then when I realized, hey, you could actually maybe make a living doing this, it sort of took off from there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It is it's a good niche. It's an important niche. I think today more than ever, good science writing is important. I remember several years ago, one of my mentors, a man named William Zinsser, who wrote this book called On Writing Well.
It's
Um,
excellent. Yeah.
yeah. So he had a chapter on science writing, and good, clear science writing is really, a craft. and it's making it accessible, making it clear. I did a couple of, I guess one of our assignments was, explain how something works. And, it was like, that's harder than you think to
Yes.
explain clearly how something works, whatever it is. And I think that in general, I think a good, clear science communication for the public is important. I guess I did some teaching at the School of Journalism and Communication at Stony Brook a couple of years ago, and of course now they have the Alan Alda, program for, I guess, Center for Communicating Science. So I
Right.
think what we realize today in this sort of age, it's important to have people who really can do this well, and you're one of them. So glad to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Sure,
And
sure.
I actually think too that the history of science component, I found as I was learning the science, that if I understood why things were discovered from an historical perspective, that made it easier to understand the science when, you had to learn all the, the problem sets,
Right, right,
as opposed to just the abstract, giving you, say, Einstein or Darwin or whatever for in a textbook because you have to learn it. And I found that actually learning how it evolved historically made the ideas even clearer,
right.
and that also kind of helped
Yeah.
and does help, I think, with the writing of it.
Right, right. So did you, in the course of researching it, did you have sort of an aha moment of like when you were looking at these various inventions, like, wait a minute, these are all happened, in Middle Ages, isn't that interesting that's, you know, sort of beyond the stereotype?
Yes, yeah. In fact, I think my first book was about the Catholic priest who came up with the first version of the Big Bang Theory.
Uh-huh.
The name of the book was The Day Without Yesterday. And Father Lemaitre, who was a Belgian Catholic priest, a World War I veteran, and I got the opportunity to write about him, basically because I realized no one else had written about him
Mm-hmm.
in the U.S. And he was one of those figures you'd kind of see in the background if you read a general history of cosmology or the Big Bang or Einstein or relativity. Lemaitre, he'd always be in there as a footnote or something, or the guy who came up with what they called the cosmic egg hypothesis. But
Mm-hmm.
as I was doing a few different articles on Einstein, he kept showing up in some of the research articles. And I
Hmm.
thought, this guy was probably a lot more cool than we realized. And
Right.
an editor basically gave me an opportunity. What happened was I was pitching an editor in New York, would you like to read my fiction? And
Huh.
he was like, fiction's really hard to sell. But I like these articles you've already written. Would you like, do you have any idea for nonfiction books? So I just popped back by email, well, what about a book about this Catholic priest? And he's like, that's a great idea.
Huh.
That's literally how it happened. But as I was researching that book, I had to go further and further back in time. There's the general kind of scientific revolution stuff leading up to Einstein. Um, and as I was researching that, I came across more and more things that just went further and further back, like into the Middle Ages. And I just thought, oh, those were far older than I thought. I thought they were more kind of recent inventions.
Right.
So that kind of lit the fuse for me in a sense for what became the newer book.
Right, right. Yeah, it certainly is, refreshing that, breaking the stereotype of, the Middle Ages is just a time of like Middle Earth,
Yeah,
everybody doing battle with one another and,
right.
feudal kings and dukes fighting it out.
Yeah.
S-
Bring out your dead. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, right, right. So tell us a little bit about the process of writing the book itself. Did you, you know, what was some of your research? Any surprises in doing so?
Yes, I didn't when it's funny because my agent and I were shopping the book idea around for a few years, and
Hmm.
I was actually starting to, worry that, okay, this is never going to happen. And then we got the offer from Prometheus Books, but they wanted the book kind of in a hurry. So,
Of
but
course.
oh boy, I had to kind of literally block out my time. Like, I'm going to need to take, 3 to 4 months just reading, and then, put my butt in the seat and just write, and get it to get it done in time. And so I reached out to a couple of people, one particular historian of science in Europe whom I've been friends with for 15 years. And
Hmm.
he specializes in not the Middle Ages, but sort of mathematics and the Renaissance. But he was really plugged in. And I just said, look, I'm going to need some help on this. Can you help me, come up with a bibliography? Here's what I need to read. Here's my table of contents. And so basically, I hired him to help me. Again, because of time constraints. And it was
Hmm.
great because he would send me books to read. I'd run out to the library and just pile them up at home, do the reading. Then I would give myself a certain number of weeks to write a chapter. I'd send him the chapter and also to 2 or 3 other historians that I've known either from since school or I've met since. And they all critique them quickly and send back comments. So it was kind of like an assembly line, like I'll write a chapter while they're reading the
Yeah,
previous one,
yeah.
and then just kind of, put the whole thing together to get it done in time. And then of course, COVID happened and everything stalled out. And I realized afterwards, you probably could have taken a lot longer to do this than you thought. But that's life, as you know, as a
Yeah,
journalist.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's right. It's a lot of waiting and hurry up and finish and wait
Yeah.
like all of a sudden. Wow, okay, yeah, yeah. It's never. Uh, I had a woman on recently, a psychologist, talking about the virtues of patience these days, and one of her definitions, I forget where she got it from, but it was like patience is being able to deal with things that don't happen in the order that you expect. you know? And I think that's very true of writing and publishing. Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So why don't we let's talk about some of the chapters. Well, let's start with your title inventions. The clock and the camshaft. I guess. Um, Now I happen to know what the camshaft is because when I was I guess maybe about 10, my parents, who were very interested in educational toys, got my brother and me the visible. There was the one thing called the visible man, and then there was another thing called the visible machine, and it was an engine, and so you had to put together an engine. So I learned, oh, this is what a camshaft is. But if it weren't for that, I'd have no idea. So why don't you talk about how the camshaft was invented and how?
It's funny you should say that because if you Google a camshaft, usually the first image that pops up is an internal combustion engine
Right.
with the intake valve, stuff
Right.
like that.
Right.
Yeah. Um, so the camshaft was probably invented, uh, well, I should say its use, the way we understand, was probably in the early centuries of the
Hmm.
Common Era, both in China and in the Roman Empire.
Okay.
I think initially scholars thought that it was invented in China and then kind of moved west. But more recently, they've discovered evidence that in Roman Spain, in ruins and stuff, that they were using mills with trip hammers to pound ore,
Hmm.
probably for the making of weapons for their armies. Right around the same time that the Chinese were using camshafts in their mills to hull rice,
Hmm.
basically for food purposes. So, but the invention basically, what was unique about it was a way to turn rotational energy into linear.
Hmm.
So mills had been around already for several centuries, both vertical water mills and horizontal water mills, again, all across the Middle East, all across the Roman Empire, and in various sizes. I mean, small villages could kind of whip together a horizontal water mill high up in a mountain, with a relatively strong stream to grind grain and so forth. And then with bigger water sources, the Romans could build huge vertical water mills and use them. Um, but the camshaft came along, I think, at a time when I think they realized, wow, we can go in a lot more directions than just grinding grain for food. If
Hmm.
you throw in a camshaft with cams, literally these little fins, now you can do all sorts of things that are, well, like for example, the Chinese were hulling rice, but then you realize, well, we could also drive the forge bellows for the blacksmiths. You could basically power a bunch of trip hammers out of sequence for fulling cloth or for pounding ore. And then if you add a crank instead of a camshaft, you can actually power sawmills And again, there's evidence of this from the Roman Empire, stone saws, which is really kind of remarkable, again, in the kind of early centuries of the Common Era. So once that camshaft, came into being, it was rapidly employed for all sorts of aspects of the economy, food, clothing, building, wood, and purposes of anything they could think up using water power.
Right.
Windmills came later.
Hmm.
Again, this is something that was invented. Some of the earliest windmills showed up in Persia. They were kind of ingeniously dug out of canyons, and they could only work from one direction. In other words, you'd kind of design this thing to face the north. So when the wind blew from the north, it would go through these kind of self-dug canyons with windmills inside them.
Right.
And they think independently, the Europeans invented windmills in the northern part, Finland, North Europe. And what they ingeniously figured out was a way to put the windmills on turrets so that you could just adjust it to whatever direction the wind was coming from.
Hmm.
So there were post mills, which were kind of simple ones that were almost like built on like a tree trunk, something really thick.
Right.
And then they started to build towers like
Mhm.
castles, stone towers, and put the windmills up on top of those. Those were kind of the later Middle Ages. But they were kind of, they were ingenious in the sense that they realized, look, we don't want to just use these when the wind's coming from the north. We want to be able to adjust quickly.
Right.
And these things in some cases would be powered by, you'd have some poor guy outside on a horse and he'd have to kind of pull the turret around to change directions.
Wow.
But that was a European invention, probably like the 11th and 12th centuries.
Wow. Wow. Well, that's a really interesting evolution of, as you point out, I think for a number of your inventions, it's really a confluence. It's not just one, even as it was done by people whose names we might not have known, but it wasn't just from one direction. It was from different cultures and different influences. And that's a great story. So, John, we're going to take actually a quick break. When we come back, we'll be talking much more with you. Author and producer John Farrell will get onto the clock and other inventions. So, folks, don't go anywhere. Lots more to talk about with John Farrell. Welcome back, folks. We're talking with John W. Farrell, the author of The Clock and the Camshaft. Now, before we continue, I wanted to let you know you can find out much more about John's work, including his articles, posts and reviews, short fiction, and so forth at his website, farrellmedia.com. That's FARRELL media.com. So, John, before the break, we were talking about the many influences that led to the camshaft, and I know that the camshaft itself was a component of the other, title invention that you mentioned, the clock. So, talk about how that contributed to the clock and what that story was about.
Sure. So the clock, I think what's fascinating about the clock is that we don't really know who invented it. The scholars assume it was probably a group of blacksmiths working with a group of millwrights, probably at the instigation of a bishop. And it wasn't really to invent necessarily a timekeeping device. What it looks like they wanted to do was automate the ringing of church bells, either in a church or in a monastery. And up until that point, you had water clocks, which weren't that reliable. You'd fill a basin with water, put a hole in it, and let the water kind of run out slowly at a certain amount of time. And as the water dropped, it kind of, went by the markers inside the bowl.
Right.
And then somebody had to stay up and keep refilling it. And then, of course, you had candles, could also be used as timekeeping devices. But again, not really that reliable, and especially if it got drafty in the castles of Northern Europe. So to automate church bells, they came up with a device. And what's fascinating is that it's sort of the reverse of what we've just been talking about, water wheels and camshafts to power various things. In the case of the clock, what they wanted to do was figure out, is there a way we could use gravity to power something? We've been using water, we've been using wind. Is there a way to harness the force of gravity to power a machine? And the problem there though was that, well, the power, everybody knows gravity, you know, we've all fallen, we know what gravity feels like, but what they had to do was figure out a way to exploit it, but inhibit it just enough so that it could be used to tell time, well, basically to tell time to the point where, okay, the bells are going to go off at midnight, so the monks can get up and do their prayers, and then the bells are going to go off again 5 hours later at dawn, so the monks can get up and do their prayers. So what's ingenious about it is the device they use, it's called a virgin foliate, was basically a way to interrupt the axle from just basically spinning out of control and the weights plummeting to the floor. So you create a device to inhibit it. And basically what it was a camshaft in reverse. So they built, if you look at it, and you can Google this, and there's an illustration in my book, it almost looks like a weird coat hanger, which with adjustable weights on either side. And then a shaft, basically a kind of a camshaft, except it's vertical, not horizontal. And there are only two cams on it, one at the top and one at the bottom, and they're sort of in reverse direction, so that the one at the top bottom stops it again, and they kind of go back and forth. You know, this is where tick tock comes from. It's this this kind of, you know, carefully designed inhibition mechanism, so that the weights can keep pulling the axle around, but very, very slowly. And what kind of fascinates me is the amount of trial and error that must have gone into this, but it also the kind of intuitive genius to realize that there was such a thing as inertia. I mean, we think of Newton, you know, the laws of inertia and, you know, physical dynamics and stuff, but these people figured it out without any kind of mathematics, without any theory, without any principles of dynamics as we would understand them. They just worked, they just knew what they knew from working with their hands and, you know, creating mills and creating all these things, and came together and said, we're going to come up with this device and see if it works. And then how often do we have to repair it? You know, can we adjust the weights and figure out what seems to work the best? And they figured this was probably at the end of the 1200s. Again, probably to build a device for a church. But then once it succeeded, it took off. I mean, all across Europe. I mean, it became a kind of a competition thing. Well, our church has to have a bigger clock than them, so let's build ours. And then, you know, within a century, I think you had the King of France establishing a standard of time for the whole country, which was, yeah, exactly, fascinating. And as you know, we've all become slaves to the clock ever since.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Well, but you know, I think that I think the stories that you tell behind these inventions are really interesting, because I think that, you know, we usually think about inventions, at least I do, you know, in terms of, you know, more conventional, you know, Thomas Edison in his lab, you know, or
Yes.
people doing, you know, experiments, and these were basically experiments in real life. People had problems to solve, and they just, as you said, there was the, instead of trial and error in a laboratory, it was trial and error in daily life, because they had to do something, fix something, make something work better, you know. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah. No, I'd like to imagine that they were sitting around, you know, after a long day's work, maybe with the beer at the fireplace, saying, okay, the weights were too heavy this time, it didn't work, let's try this again tomorrow. You know?
Right.
And how often the blacksmith had to go back and make smaller weights, or, you know,
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. This is a three beer weight. You know?
Yes, exactly.
Right. Yeah. So for you know, journalists like me, of course, people talk about the history of journalism, and it's always the, you know, the Gutenberg and the invention of the printing press. But as you point out, a printing press without accessible paper and cheap paper, you know, is it's not worth much. So talk about about paper, is the role really of paper in terms of promoting, you know, the printed word.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Gutenberg's a fascinating story. You can't help feeling terrible for the guy because, you know, he put all this work into inventing the printing press, and perfecting, you know, the right kinds of ink so that it could produce, I think he produced about 1,000 copies of the Bible. And he had been loaned the money by a wealthy lawyer. And then after selling not many copies, he basically went bankrupt, and the lawyer, basically took all the equipment away from him.
Oh,
And he
wow.
spent the rest of his life working in someone else's printing shop, and I think in sort of dying in obscurity. Um, but around this time, a little shortly later, um, the invention of paper, of course, was in China, and this definitely moved westward through Islamic kingdoms, Islamic civilization. And in Italy, is basically in Italy that the same thing. Mills were now devised to make paper, make cheap paper, basically pounding all the rags that they would use to kind of come up with the material. And once that was done, once paper, this is an interesting thing, is the initial drive for paper was for the emerging merchant class in Italy, because they needed paper to write down, to keep accounts
Mm,
about everything they were selling, everything they were buying. Um, and then this very quickly got adopted into bookmaking, so that within, again, a very short amount of time, books could be produced much more cheaply, and so that they wouldn't be just, these expensive Bibles sold to, like, rich clerics, but now everyday people could buy their own Bibles and pamphlets, and this opened up the door to all sorts of possibilities. The bad news for the Catholic Church, of course, was that in those days, once people started reading their own Bibles, they started questioning a lot of the things that the church had been teaching them, and said, "Hey, wait a minute, this isn't in the Bible. Where did this come from?" And that's one of the main instigators of the Protestant Reformation.
wow.
Um, and But also down the road, also the scientific revolution, because again, as literacy spread, you had more and more people wanting to go to the university and study science.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah. Another thing that um, people sort of take for granted. We go and we visit these magnificent churches, but it took some specific inventions, like you mentioned, things like the flying buttresses, which you usually don't learn about until you take an art history class in college. But just talk a bit about how that came
yes.
to be. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the rare cases where we can attach a name, not so much to the invention of the flying buttress, but to the inspiration that kind of drove all the inventions that were kind of put together to build the cathedrals. And that was Abbot Soujir. Um, he was a Belgian abbot, who was kind of working in reaction to what was the kind of leftover, Roman style of architecture. Churches were basilicas, kind of in the shapes of crosses. They were huge.
Right.
They were sturdy, but the way they were built, the windows were very small, and even on nice days, going to church was kind of a gloomy experience. So they'd have to light lots of candles and so forth. And the abbot wanted to figure out, there's got to be a way to get more light into our churches so that they're more uplifting. And
Mm-hmm.
this was right around the same time too, where glassmakers were inventing, stained glass, and
Hmm.
using colors to make a glass. So the architects were like, okay, we want to build these uh, so that we can have bigger windows. That means thinner walls. Well, how are we going to, we got thinner walls, that's dangerous. So then they came up with the flying buttresses, the outside sort of buttresses. Well, these will hold up the walls, and we can make the walls as high as we want.
Hmm.
In some cases, well over 100 feet. And then we can put in these huge windows and really kind of cheer up the interior of the churches. And
Interesting.
as they were doing it, they also kind of came up with the pointed arches, just the doorways, which again could kind of bear more weight than the older style rounded arches of the Roman style. And then rib vaults, which were an invention to kind of, again, hold more weight on the roofs. So basically you had the cathedrals going a lot higher with a lot bigger windows. And to this day, people, they're a huge tourist attraction, as
Right.
you know, if you've been to Europe.
Yeah. 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 Well, they are magnificent. I must say, bringing the light like that, sort of in combination with these stained glass windows, yeah, interesting. Going back to your premise of trying to solve a problem or trying to make something better, but in real life, as opposed to, well, certainly hard to build a cathedral in a lab. So, yeah,
Yes.
yes. So that's interesting.
And it's
So,
funny when you think about now, like how long we kind of gripe about no, it's going to take 5 or 10 years to build a new highway overpass. And
Right.
these cathedrals often outlived the people who started to build them. In fact, it would take sometimes 2 to 3 generations to see them through to completion. And I still marvel at the idea that they actually got done, that somewhere halfway through the second generation said, screw this, let's do something else. They actually
Right.
finished them.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, Many of your things, your inventions are, actual products and so forth. But one of the things I found interesting too was, you talk about not just specific devices, but what I guess I refer to sort of as social inventions.
Yes.
Like universities and labor guilds being the outgrowth of the legal revolution. So let's talk about that a little bit. I'm fascinated by that.
Yes. So that was in the 1100s. The popes were getting worried about their autonomy, the encroachment of European kings,
Hmm.
monarchs, the dukes, and to protect themselves. I think it was Pope Gregory VII. He basically initiated what they call a papal legal revolution. He basically it was Gratian, I think, one of the monks, who basically synthesized all of the law texts that they had available to them. So what was left over from the Roman Empire, the old Roman law,
Hmm.
what they knew from the Bible, the law codes from the Bible, and then the laws from the local European kingdoms, the Germanic kingdoms, and synthesized all of these into a kind of a new comprehensive law so that the church could kind of protect its own autonomy. The big thing the popes were worried about was they didn't want kings appointing bishops. The pope wanted that right reserved to himself.
Hmm.
And to protect, again, all of the priests and the churches from being seized or taken over by the governments. Once they did that, um, again, kind of other people realized, hey, we can also use this law to protect ourselves. So like the blacksmiths or the weavers realized, hey, we can create
Hmm.
a guild, literally, we're going to incorporate ourselves. We'll have a charter, and this is who we are, and we can kind of like stand up for our rights.
Yeah.
And this also kind of came to uh, be really important for the universities, the cathedral schools, as they got bigger and bigger, as more and
Hmm.
more students came in. They created their own charters, and the University of Paris, the
Right.
University of Bologna and Oxford, and again they became kind of independent entities for the first time. And even though, again, the bishops tried to exercise as much control over what they taught, which is something I can get into a little later, they nevertheless felt that they were independent from the religious authorities and again wanted to kind of govern themselves.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's interesting, that again, in telling your stories, how many of these things are really the confluence of different influences, political and religious, kind of in concert and sometimes in opposition.
Yes.
Um, yeah. And, so, Don, we're going to take another quick break. But when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about that and also about, the confluences of different civilizations that contribute to some of these inventions.
Sure.
So, folks, we're going to come back after a quick break with John Farrell. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, folks. Once again, I'm talking with John Farrell, author of the book "The Clock and the Camshaft." By the way, if you're looking him up, don't forget it's John W. Farrell, because there are other Farrells who have different middle initials, and so our John Farrell is John W. Farrell. But anyway, so John, before the break, we were talking about various confluences of influence, and one of them I wanted to elaborate on is just how Islamic civilization during this period contributed to the cultural advances in the West. And so you mentioned, for example, preserving the ancient Greek texts, which we don't think of that something that Islamic culture did.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I grew up, thinking that, oh yeah, Aristotle, Plato, a lot of that stuff, we just kind of inherited in a direct line, through the Roman Empire.
Right.
Uh, and not realizing that, well, there was kind of an interesting detour that they didn't teach us about when I was a kid.
Right.
And that's that after the collapse of the Roman Empire, especially in the West, there were, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, kind of didn't have as catastrophic a decline as the West did. Um, but basically everything was lost in terms of intellectual. Most of Aristotle, almost all of Aristotle, a lot of Plato, a lot of medicine, a lot of philosophy disappeared. And then in the 11th and 12th centuries, as right around the time of the Crusades, which is of course kind of ironic, you had monks going to Spain basically because they had heard that the Arabs had more reliable astronomical charts, and these would be necessary if they were going to improve their means of predicting way in advance, what are the dates for Easter? What are the dates for, all the kind of holy days? So there was a kind of a religious motivation there to get kind of better data. And once they got to Toledo, and this is again during the process of what they called the Reconquest, the Spanish kings were slowly retaking the Iberian Peninsula away from the Muslim rulers. And Toledo turned out to be just a wealth of texts, not just the astronomical stuff they were looking for, but once they arrived there, they realized, oh my God, all of Aristotle, all of these texts that they thought had been lost after the fall of the Roman Empire were available in Arabic. So it was like, oh, we need to translate this back into Latin. And around the same time, something similar was happening in Sicily. Now in Sicily, you actually had the original Greek texts of Aristotle and Plato and so forth. And they very soon sent people there to translate those back into Latin as well. So basically, over the course of 150 years, right around the time when the cathedral schools were evolving into the universities, you had a sudden huge influx into these schools of translations of Aristotle, of Plato, of Arabic medicine, Arabic philosophy, Jewish philosophy, and it just had a huge impact to the point where some of the bishops of Paris were becoming alarmed about, well, what is in these books, and seems to, contradict Christian doctrine. And there were fights, during the course of Thomas Aquinas's life, for example, there were fights about what could and could not be taught. And as I mentioned before, the universities kind of stood their ground. They kind of hemmed and hawed and complained about it, but they never banned Aristotle, which is what some of the bishops wanted because of some of his pagan philosophies. And that's just a fascinating era, because you had this all going on at the same time we were trying to retake Jerusalem. Basically the Crusades were going on. So it was a war, but at the same time, you had these fantastic cultural transformations happening at a very friendlier level.
Yeah. During the break, I was talking to you a bit about a book that I read a little while ago called Ornament of the World, which was an interesting, it's sort of the time period it covers is a little bit before yours, but basically the Middle Ages. And it's really the story of how, Christian, Islamic, and Jewish populations lived in peace for several hundred years in southern Spain, and I guess, and under the rule of an Islamic ruler who had to flee northern Africa because he was involved in battles for control of who was going to establish the caliphate, and he lost, so he had to flee for his life. But when he settled in northern Spain, he created this culture of tolerance, essentially, in which a lot of what you're talking about happened, and it was the Islamic culture that he basically used as a framework, to keep the peace, but also tolerate, many different cultures and religions and influences. So again, I think these are things we kind of don't think about. We kind of sectorize, inventions and cultures, and a lot of things are just a fascinating integration of lots of influences.
Yeah, and ways of thinking too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So before we only have a shorter last segment, but I wanted to give you some time, John, to just talk about some of your other work. I mean, so we mentioned your earlier book on The Day Without Yesterday. Um, uh, you're you've done other work. You've done some fiction. You've done reviews. Talk a bit about the relationship between the fiction and nonfiction. I know that one of the things you mentioned earlier is absolutely true. When you do pieces of fiction and you try to get an agent, they're like, ah, fiction. I can't sell fiction, and then they gravitate back to your nonfiction until they realize you're a really good writer, and then they say, well, maybe show me some of your fiction. Let's see what happens now. But anyway, so just tell me about the relationship of different genres of your work.
I've published a handful of short stories over, say, the last, I hate to say it, the last 20 years
Uh-huh.
in different magazines, some of which no longer exist. And this is another thing you'll be able to understand as a journalist is how quickly some, exciting new magazines come and go. um,
Right.
but yes, I started out initially as a fiction writer and then moved into nonfiction because, that's where the opportunities were.
Right.
But and also I've been interested in film. Another thing I did was like writing scripts. One of the interesting things that opportunities that came up was I got to write a script for the late British actor Christopher Lee.
Hmm.
And it was sort of based on his autobiography, his service during World War II, and blended with the history of my wife's family. My
Hmm.
wife's family is from Slovenia. And something in his biography kind of inspired this idea for a film script. So I wrote the film script for him, which he really liked, and he never got around a chance to producing it. So a few years ago, I got together with some actors and pulled a little bit of funding together and made the film myself, and it's up on Amazon now. And but again, it's not history of science, but it is history and fascinating history about what happened in Europe after the end of World War II. A lot of these kind of dark stories, and it was interesting because my wife's parents would often talk about these massacres that took place in Slovenia at the very end of the war. And I remember thinking, I've never heard of these. Is this just something they're talking about? And then when I read his autobiography, he made a reference to them. And I thought, oh, there's something fascinating here. So that was basically like a 1 hour feature, which was really interesting. And we combined footage from Slovenia, which I shot there, and we shot it over here.
Right.
Using professional stage actors with British accents.
Of course. Yeah.
But so that
And
was a different thing to do.
yeah.
But I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. And it's called A Fine Pavement, right?
A Fine Pavement, yes,
Right.
yeah,
Right. And people can see it up on Amazon. You said Amazon
yeah. It's
Prime.
on Amazon, yeah, Amazon
Yeah.
Prime, yeah.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, they're interesting. One of the things that I've done just a little bit of work in film, mostly in graduate school, but I think it's an instructive experience. I think you really, certainly when you're writing books, the importance of sort of the structure of the book. Does it really work? And with film, it really teaches you that lesson.
Yes,
If the
oh,
structure doesn't
absolutely,
work, the film, you can't watch it. It doesn't make sense. Yeah.
yes,
So right.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
readers will have a lot more tolerance for tangents when you're writing nonfiction that they will absolutely not tolerate when you're trying to tell a story.
Exactly. Yeah. So before we close, though, I'd like to then also just talk a little bit about just prospectively going forward. Looking at some context. Um, what do you think are some of the the more important inventions in more contemporaneous times?
Um, Physically, well, of course, speaking of camshafts, um, and we just take them so much for granted, but I think
Hmm.
the internal combustion engine, the automobile,
Right.
has been transformative, both for good and for bad. The bad part is what it's done to the environment.
Right.
Sometimes when you look at the Earth at night, sometime and see these patterns of traffic and realize, oh my God, it's just like millions and millions. It's like, what is
Yeah.
it doing to the surface of the planet? But on the other hand, a car, what a car can do for a small family, in the middle of nowhere. I mean, the freedom it can still give you in terms of being able to travel to places to work and to make something of your life. It's still hard to kind of, I mean, I think it's still something that has to be appreciated. I think in America, it's probably less so, but I think in places, like China and India, where, and in South America, where economies are still kind of like lifting themselves up.
Hmm.
Automobiles are a huge factor. And again, it's kind of a strange thing where you feel like, on the one hand, they rely on fossil fuel, and we're going to use it all up eventually. We have to figure out another means of doing it. But at the same time, we've created something that you know is a extremely useful, fruitful product for poor people, for people who need to travel great distances to work and so forth.
Right.
You had some of that too in the Middle Ages, when they were deforesting the hell out of Europe and didn't
Right.
realize it.
Right, right. Yeah. I guess another thing today too is medical technology, right? I mean, I think we kind of take it for granted now. Like, well, I don't know, we take it for granted, but it's all around us. And certainly as we were developing COVID vaccines, the rapidity of well, accumulated knowledge over the years to create these things. I think it seems to me that's one of the areas where there's going to be a lot of innovation in medical and health, and that sort of combining, sort of personal, lifestyle and issues, and health in general, and just discovering things that we never really discovered about our biology.
Right. Oh yeah. And I think it's amazing. I know it's been hard, the pandemic, but when you think how quickly they came up with a vaccine, it's just,
Right.
It's almost like World War II level ingenuity. Like, let's just go do it and make it happen.
Right. Right. Yeah. One area which probably would need a whole other show to talk about, but I was interested in your article about, artificial, intelligence, and, you wrote a great piece. I think you can find it on your website, right? Is it on your
Yes,
website? Yeah.
it's on my website. It's Commonweal. Yeah, I publish it.
Yeah. So that's an area I think we really just started to scratch the surface, and I'm not sure we, as you put it, they understand the promise versus the peril of it.
Yes, I'm kind of a science fiction geek, so I like to be optimistic about it.
Hmm.
But yes, there's. I mean, the downside of it we're already seeing is how automation is putting so many people out of work, because companies figure they can save money by just coming up. I mean, not like robots, like smart
Hmm.
robots, the way we think of it, but they're smart enough to put a whole class of people out of work, which is not a good thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think it also raises a lot of issues that you mentioned, which is really understanding what these machines do versus what is true consciousness. I don't think we really understand what that is. And these things, yeah, you can program them to do things, but they're still
Yes.
basically, you know, um, you know, humans putting in, programming, and structuring the kind of thinking. So they're not only thinking on their own, but
Right.
but that will be the subject for a whole other conversation that hopefully we'll have with you sometime soon.
That'd be
Um,
great.
yeah. So unfortunately, John, that's where we'll have to leave it today. But I want to thank you for a very informative, insightful, unusual conversation. If people have questions for you, what's the best way to reach you?
I'm on Twitter, and on my website, I've got a contact page,
Okay.
my email. Yeah. But it's John W. Farrell at Gmail. It's the easiest email you can think
Great.
of.
Okay. Good. Good. Okay, folks. So tell your friends if they missed my conversation with John today, you can still listen to it as a podcast on voiceamerica.com. Search for my show 45 Forward. You can find it on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or go to my website, rowellresources.com, and click on 45 Forward. So be sure to join me next Monday, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll be talking with Rhonda Schwartz from the Administration for Community Living, a federal agency that's leading the nation's observance of Older Americans Month, which is every May. And she'll be talking about this year's theme, Age My Way. So, folks, until then, keep moving forward, 45 forward.